So today I want to show you a few sequencers from the docB collection that are definitely worth experimenting with. I've been using these sequencers for quite some time now, and there is so much to explore, so many inspiring results to be found. I truly believe that this collection, the docB collection, is pure gold. Yes, it's a big collection of modules, but there are many highlights just waiting to be discovered. So let's start with the classic sequencer, the Klee. So the Klee sequencer is really a playground for experimenting with sequences and composition. It's a bit similar to how the Turing machine works, so it will generate voltage by combining the values of multiple steps depending on active bits that are moving throughout the sequence. So let's really see this quickly. For example, I will load the first bit just by clicking on it and then hitting here load. Right, and I will get the respective voltage of the different steps according to where this bit is. In this case, from the A sequence, right, we have here various outputs. And I can also select from which steps to have a gate as well. So for example, here with the bus here, the gate bus 1, I will choose step, let's say 1 and 6. Right, so now only on these steps the voice will be triggered, but of course when adding more bits, things get a bit more interesting. So I will add also bit 3 and bit 7. Right, so again the values will be added, and whenever there's an active bit on the chosen steps, the FM operator in this case will be triggered. Now I can also add sequence B to this, so instead of using output A, I will use A plus B, so combining both A and B sequences. And then I will load also a few bits on sequence B, so let's say 1, 2, and 5. Right, so again the values are added, and I can also make this sequence longer by activating the B inverted this mode here. Right, have a look at what happens to the B sequence. Right, the B sequence will now play once normal, and once the bits will get inverted, so the active will turn inactive and vice versa, so we get a longer sequence. Right, so again, there is quite a lot to explore. I have here a couple of examples. Right, a nice feature of this sequencer is the ability to add randomness by randomly turning bits on and off, and again by that changing the resulting voltage levels. So here I have kick all as my voice, going through a filter, some delay, there is some modulation. Right, and you can hear there is variation in the sequence. So what I'm doing here, I have two clock divisions. One will, as you can see now, will activate the randomness. So again, randomly bits will turn on and off and will change the resulting voltage. And another clock division will reset the sequence to the original state. Right, so there is always a repetitive sequence, and every now and then there is some randomization, and then the sequence goes back to being repetitive. Right, just like this, so it's really easy to add some variation. And it's also quite nice to sequence multiple voices again, since we have various outputs here that we can use, and also 3 so-called gate buses. So here I have 3 VCV VCOs, right? I'm mixing them, sending them through a filter and some delay. Right, 2 of them are getting the steady sequences A and B. Right, and one of them I'm using a sequential switch to switch between the other outputs and get a bit more variation. Let me unmute this. Right, so again, there is some stability, there is some randomness. I'm also using all 3 gate buses and also the middle one here, which is quite interesting, because it will output a gate only when both voices are not playing in this case, because it's set to N or. Right, so we get some sort of a separation also between the voices. Another quite interesting sequencer is the Cyclic sequencer. Now here we have, as you can see, 6 channels. Each one has a dedicated clock and also various controls. Let me turn this on here. Right, so you can see we have here, for example, now an 8-step sequence. I can change the length, I can make it longer, right, up to 32 steps. Right, make it shorter. I can change the starting point with the offset. Of course, everything has also a CV input. Right, and like this get also some variation. And I can also change the stride, which will be basically the distance between the steps, how long the distance would be between each of the steps. So if now it's 1, it will move between all of the steps one by one. But if I change this to 2, right, it will skip 1 step, to 3, it will skip 2 steps, and so on and so forth. So if, for example, I have here an 8-step sequence, and I change the stride to, let's say, 5, right, we get a bit more variation because it will skip a few steps. And of course, again, everything has also a CV input, and we have 6 channels. So again, I have here a few examples. Here I have a few sequences going on, right, each with its own clock, as you can see, right, so they are all moving, you can see them here, they are all moving a bit differently. The sound itself, the voice itself, is 3 VCV VCOs mixed into a filter. There is some delay, some modulation, right, it will sound like this. Right, so again, different length, as you can see, different clocks, right, so the values are the same, the steps are the same, but the sequences will start and will move in different ways. And also I'm using 2 additional sequences from within the sequencer itself to modulate the offset or the starting point of 2 of the sequences, right, so you can see here also there is always movement, there is always variation. Right, now you can see also that each step has also a CV input, right, so we can control also the values externally. Here I'm using 2 random signals, once to modulate one of the steps, right, and you can see it's always moving, so it will be always a random step. Right, and once also to modulate the offset or the starting point of this sequence. So again, we have some variation. Each cycle is a bit different. Right, let me unmute this. The voice itself is here, the prodigal son from Flag, going through a filter, some delay. And I have here a few more sequences set to random. You can see they have different play modes. And the last one is totally random, which means that I can use this for random modulation or random sequencing of all sorts of different parameters here, like the envelope, like the filter. Right, this just needs a nice bass drone, which I have here with the classic VCO, and a sub-oscillator with a sine oscillator from, oh yes, from Bog Audio. The next sequencer might look like a simple module, but it has many tricks up its sleeve that can help you create more complex results. For example, the dice function that will randomize the sequence according to different parameters you can set. So for example, if I trigger it now, right, all steps will be randomized. But I can change, for example, the density. So if I take this down to 8, right now only 8 steps will stay active. Right, if I trigger it again, we will still get only 8 steps, but with different values and different patterns. Right, so like this you can find the sequence that you like. I can also choose how many values will be randomized with the hold function, how many values will be held. Right, so if I take this, for example, to 100%, all of the values will stay, but only the gates will be randomized. Right, so the position of the gates, as you can see. Right, so it's quite easy to create variation. Again, I have here a few examples. I have here a 5-step sequence, right, as you can see here, and I'm using a clock division here with the dice function, right, to randomize the gates and values, but I have the density set to 3, so there will be always only 3 steps active out of the 5. Let me unmute this for a second. Right, so it will always change, but always only 3 steps will be active. The voice itself here is the twist VCO mixed with the VCV VCO. Right, and there is also, of course, some delay involved. Now there is also the variation control here on the sequencer. Right, in this case we can add or remove steps according to how you set this here, add or remove gates. Right, but we can always go back to the original sequence if you reset it. Right, so you can add some variation and then reset it and go back to the original sequence. In this case, I'm doing this with chances, as you can see here from count modular. This will add probability, and once it will, again, according to the probability, will add variation, or in this case, will add gates. And once it will reset things and will go back to the original sequence. Let me unmute this. This is the VCO going through a bandpass filter. Right, so again, there is some variation and some stability, which is always fun. Now this sequencer is also really nice for modulation. As you can see here, I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 of them for modulation, right? They will always be a bit different. The sound here is Tremor 2, which I'm modulating. This is going through a Chronoblob 2, which I'm using as a sort of a glitch effect, right? It will sound like this. Right, so you can also use this for all sorts of different modulation purposes. I have here also a bass, also sequenced with another ASeq. Right, in this case I'm using a flip-flop, so once it will trigger the variation, or this one actually, once it will trigger the reset. So again, we have some variation, we have some stability. The bass itself is kickball from the Faco, of course. Oh yeah. So now we are getting into something a bit different. I personally really like this concept, basically driving sequencers with a phase signal or a continuous signal rather than with clock pulses. Now I'm using here another module from this collection, the P16. This will output voltage in steps, right, as you can see here on the scope. Now I can use this to scan or to drive the sequencer. In this case, this sequencer is the TD4. And here we have ADDR inputs, right, that I can use, as you can see, to scan through this sequencer. Right, so you use another signal, not a clock, but another continuous signal to scan through it. In this case, in the case of the P16, we have also patterns that we can change. So again, this will change the voltage and also the sequence itself. Right, and I can also change the distance between these jumps by changing the size. So for example, if I change this, now it's set to 16, if I change this to 4, let's say, right, we will get only 4 steps. The same with 8, if I change this to 8, we get 8 steps. Right, but if I change this to, let's say, 5, something interesting will happen. Right, all in all, it will still have 16 steps, but now we will get 3 cycles of 5 steps, so we have 15, and another extra step, right, to make it again 16. The same with 7, so we will get twice 7 and then 2 more steps. Now in the case of the TD4, let me just disconnect this, we have 16 channels. Again, we have 16 different playheads that we can use. So what I'm doing here, for example, I have a few more modules from this collection. Again, the P16, but also the PXY and the P4. All of them will work more or less the same, so they will output voltage that you can use to scan through this and other sequencers. Right, and you can see the playheads here. Right, the different colors. So the first 2 playheads, the first 2 sequences will sequence 2 VCOs, VCV VCOs going through a nice wave shaper. Right, and again, the values, the CV itself is the same for all the different playheads, but how they run, how they move is different for each of the playhead. Right, another sequence is sequencing here kick all with a bit of modulation. Right, I believe this is the purple sequence or the blue one. And another one here I have with dark energy and Prince of Perception. So again, we have now 4 different playheads in the same sequencer. So we can get lots and lots of variation and nice textures also. And of course, this will work with any signal, right? So here I'm using LFOs and random signals. I have one modulated LFO, right? This is the red sequence or the red signal here. Right, so I'm modulating its frequency once a random signal. Right, this is the green sequence, and once another modulated LFO, which is again the blue or the purple, whatever this is here. Right, so we have 3 different sequences that are running just by LFOs scanning through the sequence. Right, the voice itself is the VCV VCO. In this case, I'm using also polyphony. Right, it will sound like this. Let me solo this. Right, there are also polyphonic inputs and outputs here that you can use. So I'm using polyphony just so I don't need to use 3 VCOs. Right, and you can hear the sequences. They are not synced to anything. They are being modulated even. And I'm just using the LFOs to scan through this sequence just to add again some texture. And of course I have here also a bass, again the classic VCO sub-bass with a sine oscillator from Bog Audio. The pitch is coming from the bass module from Sively. you're still with me because this next one is quite interesting as well, and it will work also with the phase signal. Now in this case, I'm using again a module from the same collection to drive it, right? It will once drive it horizontally, as you can see, through the X CV input, and once vertically through the Y CV input. Right now, this sequencer, the C42, is more of a gate sequencer, but not only. So I can either enter steps manually, just like this. Right, if I want something like this, for example. Right, or I can, if I zoom in a bit, I can activate the random function, right, and have a look at the grid. This will randomize things. Right, and now I can use also one of the CV outputs. Here we have various CV outputs that will output CV according to the state of the various gates and where the playhead is, right? So for example here, CV top left output, it will sound like this. Right, so you can also have pitch sequences, for example, or also modulation. We will see this also soon enough. Now, another interesting feature here is the generation feature. Let me stop this for a second and let me show you. Right, so here I have a sequence, already a steady sequence, and again, I'm using this for modulation with tremor too. This is just the oscillator part. Right, and then I have the noise part going also through some delay. Again, using two P16 modules, one will sequence this or will scan through this horizontally, one will scan through this vertically. Right, so now again we have the generation feature here. Each time I trigger it, the sequence will evolve and change according to different guidelines. If you are familiar with something like the Game of Life, for example, it works more or less the same. So if I trigger it once, right, it will change, it will sort of evolve. I can trigger it again and again and again, and the sequence will change and evolve until I hit reset. And then it will go back to the original sequence, which is always great. You have some variation, and then you can always go back to the original sequence. Right, so what I have here a switch to switch between a trigger with probability and basically nothing, right? So sometimes it will send out a trigger and sometimes not. I will use this to trigger the generation. Right, and then I will use a clock division to reset everything and go back to the original sequence. So let's listen to this for a second. Right, so again we have some variation, and then we go back to the original sequence. So we have also some stability. Right, which is always interesting. Now, this sequencer, the C42, is also polyphonic, which means that, as you can see here, we can have multiple playheads, up to 16 different playheads you can have here running at the same time. In this case, I have 4. I'm merging 4 P16 modules, right, with different patterns, different sizes. And this is running 4 different playheads. Right, so I have 4 different sequences from one C42, and this sequencer is also an expander that gives me a few more CV outputs, a few more choices, right? And again, these are also polyphonic because we have 4 playheads. Let me solo this for a second. The voice itself is an FM operator, or 2 FM operators as an FM voice. Right, and you can hear and you can see that we have 4 different voices. And with the expander, I'm switching between different variations of the sequence. Right, again, just to get a bit more variation, also pitch-wise. Right, and that's it. I really hope that you could see the potential of these modules and of this collection in general. There is so much more to explore. Thank you again for watching. Cheers.